It was a crisp Friday evening in late October when Sarah Thompson received the email. The subject line read, "Exclusive Weekend Gateway, Private Estate in the Catskills, New York." Sarah, a freelance journalist based in Manhattan, had been feeling burnt out from her relentless work schedule. The idea of a weekend away from the city, surrounded by the serene beauty of the Catskills, was too tempting to resist. The email was from an old acquaintance, Daniel Carter, whom she hadn't seen in years. Daniel had inherited a sprawling estate from his late uncle, and he was inviting a select group of friends for a weekend of relaxation and camaraderie. The estate, known as Blackthorn Manor, was nestled deep within the woods, far from the nearest town. Sarah had heard rumors about the place, whispers of its eerie history and the mysterious circumstances surrounding Daniel's uncle's death. But she brushed them off as mere gossip. She replied to the email, accepting the invitation. By Saturday morning, she was packed and ready to go. The drive from Manhattan to the Catskills was a little over 2 hours, and as she navigated the winding roads, the dense forest seemed to close in around her. The GPS signal grew weaker the deeper she went, and by the time she reached the estate, it had completely vanished. Blackthorn Manor loomed ahead, a massive Gothic structure with towering spires and ivy-covered walls. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Sarah parked her car and stepped out, her breath visible in the cold air. She felt a shiver run down her spine, but she attributed it to the chill. Daniel greeted her at the door with a warm smile. He looked much the same as she remembered, tall with dark hair and piercing blue eyes. But there was something different about him, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. He led her inside, where a small group of guests had already gathered in the grand foyer. There were 5 others: Rachel, a photographer; Mark, a lawyer; Claire, a nurse; Tom, a musician; and Lisa, a college professor. The interior of the manor was just as imposing as the exterior, with high ceilings, ornate chandeliers, and dark wood paneling. The walls were adorned with portraits of stern-looking men and women, their eyes seeming to follow Sarah as she moved through the room. Daniel gave them a brief tour, pointing out the library, the dining room, and the sitting room, where they would be spending most of their time. As the evening wore on, the group settled into the sitting room, where a fire crackled in the hearth. Daniel poured drinks, and they began to share stories about their lives and careers. But as the night deepened, the conversation took a darker turn. Rachel mentioned that she had heard rumors about the manor being haunted, and Mark chimed in with a story about a local legend involving a witch who had once lived in the woods. Daniel laughed off their concerns, but Sarah noticed a flicker of unease in his eyes. She decided to change the subject, and the conversation returned to lighter topics. But as the clock struck midnight, a sudden knock at the door silenced the room. Daniel rose to answer the door, and the group watched in tense silence as he opened it to reveal a tall, gaunt man dressed in a long black coat. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were sunken and dark. He introduced himself as Mr. Blackwood, a neighbor who lived further up the mountain. He claimed to have seen the lights on in the manor and wanted to welcome them to the area. Daniel invited him in, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. There was something unsettling about Mr. Blackwood, something that made Sarah's skin crawl. He spoke in a low, gravelly voice, and his words were laced with an undercurrent of menace. He told them stories about the history of the manor, about the tragedies that had befallen its previous occupants, and about the strange occurrences that had been reported over the years. As he spoke, the fire in the hearth began to flicker and die, casting the room into shadow. The temperature dropped, and Sarah felt a cold breeze brush against her skin, even though the windows were closed. Mr. Blackwood's eyes seemed to glow in the dim light, and his smile was more of a grimace. Finally, he rose to leave, but as he reached the door, he turned back to the group and said, "Be careful. The woods have eyes and the manor has secrets. Not all who enter leave." With that, he was gone, leaving the group in a stunned silence. The group decided to turn in for the night, but sleep did not come easily to Sarah. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of Mr. Blackwood and his ominous warning. The manor was eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the rustle of the wind outside. At some point, she must have drifted off, because she was awakened by a loud crash. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened. The sound had come from somewhere downstairs. She grabbed her robe and slipped out of her room, making her way down the darkened hallway. The other guests were also emerging from their rooms, their faces pale and drawn. They followed the sound to the library, where they found one of the bookshelves had toppled over, scattering books across the floor. Daniel was already there, examining the damage. He claimed it must have been an accident, but Sarah noticed that his hands were trembling. As they cleaned up the mess, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around the room, her eyes falling on the portraits that lined the walls. The faces seemed more menacing now, their eyes gleaming in the dim light. She felt a chill run down her spine and quickly looked away. The rest of the night passed without incident, but Sarah slept fitfully, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and whispered warnings. The next morning, the group gathered in the dining room for breakfast. The mood was subdued, and no one mentioned the events of the previous night. Daniel tried to lighten the atmosphere with jokes and stories, but his efforts fell flat. After breakfast, they decided to explore the grounds. The estate was vast, with sprawling gardens, a greenhouse, and a small lake. The woods surrounding the manor were dense and dark, and Sarah felt a sense of foreboding as they ventured deeper into the trees. They came across an old stone well, its rim covered in moss and ivy. Rachel leaned over to peer inside, but Mark pulled her back, warning her to be careful. As they stood there, Sarah thought she heard a faint whisper coming from the well. She strained to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. They continued their exploration, but the sense of unease grew with each step. The woods seemed to close in around them, the trees twisting and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time they returned to the manor, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grounds. The group was silent as they made their way back inside, each lost in their own thoughts. That night, the atmosphere in the manor was even more oppressive than before. The group gathered in the sitting room, but the conversation was strained, and the fire did little to dispel the chill that had settled over the room. As the hours passed, the tension grew. Sarah felt a growing sense of dread, as if something terrible was about to happen. She tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to her like a second skin. At around midnight, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The fire in the hearth died, and the temperature dropped sharply. Sarah heard a faint whisper, barely audible, but it seemed to come from all around her. "Get out," the voice said. "Leave while you still can." The group scrambled to their feet, their voices rising in panic. Daniel tried to calm them, but even he seemed shaken. They fumbled in the dark, searching for flashlights or candles, but the darkness was impenetrable. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from upstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. The group froze, their hearts pounding. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be right outside the door. The door creaked open, and a cold breeze swept through the room. Sarah felt a presence, something dark and malevolent, and she knew that they were no longer alone. The lights flickered back on, revealing the room in stark relief. The group was huddled together, their faces pale and terrified. The door was wide open, but there was no one there. Daniel stepped forward, his face grim. "We need to leave," he said. "Now!" But as they turned to go, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The portraits on the walls seemed to come alive, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Sarah felt a cold hand grip her arm, and she turned to see Mr. Blackwood standing beside her. His face twisted into a grotesque smile. "You should have listened," he said. "Now it's too late." The room began to spin, and Sarah felt herself being pulled into the darkness. The last thing she saw was Daniel's face, filled with terror as the shadows closed in around them. Sarah awoke to the sound of birds chirping. She was lying on the ground outside the manor, the morning sun shining down on her. The other guests were scattered around her, all of them unconscious but alive. She sat up, her head pounding, and looked around. The manor stood silent and still, its windows dark and lifeless. There was no sign of Mr. Blackwood, no trace of